Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Old State House. We're delighted to have you here. My name is Rebecca Tabor-Conover. I'm head of public programs here, and really wonderful to see the sunshine outside and think about that thing we've probably all been longing for, which is the summertime. And we're delighted to have you here with our program today about lighthouses. We are really excited to be partnering with the Judy Dworin Performance Project on this program, and you'll hear more about that in the course of today's program. A couple of things I wanted to mention before we get started. As many of you know, we do offer monthly conversations at noon. Next month, April, we actually have a double dose of conversations at noon. You can come back and join us next Thursday on April the 9th and join us for Ending the Civil War, Connecticut's History and Closing the Commemoration of the American Civil War with Dr. Matthew Warschauer. And then a couple weeks later, on Tuesday, April the 21st at noon, join us for a talk and panel discussion on exploring Connecticut and the slave trade. You have a lot of goodies on your seat today about the Judy Dworin Performance Project performances coming up, as well as information about our upcoming April programs. I wanted to let you know that at the conclusion of today's program, please join us in the gift shop and you can purchase a book from Jeremy if you would like that. And also, I'm going to ask that you please fill out the surveys that are on your chairs, because we do actually read them and use them in planning for our next programs. So without further ado, thank you for being here. And I am delighted to be able to introduce my colleague and friend from the Connecticut Network, our senior producer for programs, Diane Smith.
Thanks, Rebecca. Glad to see all of you here today. I have to say that Judy, who you'll be hearing from in a little while, was really the impetus for this program because of a wonderful project that she's working on. But after the winter we had, when somebody said a few months ago, what if we talk about lighthouses? I don't know about you. I mean, I suppose lighthouses were at their most useful in stormy times, but to me that spelled beautiful day on Long Island Sound. I said, I need to be able to imagine that, so we're going to do a program on lighthouses, so we're glad you felt the same and that you joined us. From Greenwich to Stonington, 20 lighthouses dot our Connecticut shoreline. And although they really have been surpassed by much more advanced navigation aids, they do continue to fascinate us. One of our panelists today shared this with me, this quote. A Coast Guard officer once commented that from the lantern of New London Harbor Light, one can see more lighthouses than from any other place on Earth. Now, it's not because of the density of the lighthouses necessarily, it's because the glacial conformation of Long Island Sound, that from New London Harbor Lighthouse, you can see the coastline, the islands, and all the way to the far shore of Long Island, all the way to Montauk Point. So you can see more lighthouses from there than anywhere else. The lighthouses themselves, of course, are very interesting, but even more so maybe the stories of the lighthouse keepers and their families, from the woman who saved nearly 24 lives over 6 decades, to the keeper who reported spotting sea serpents and also reported cavorting with mermaids in rather great detail, which we'll hear about a little bit more later. Those are the stories that have captivated Jeremy D'Entremont. He is a writer, a photographer, and a maritime historian. Jeremy has been called the leading expert on New England's historic lighthouses. He is the author or co-author of more than 10 books, including The Lighthouses of Connecticut, The Lighthouse Handbook, New England, and Ocean-Born Mary, The Truth Behind a New Hampshire Legend. Jeremy is the historian for the American Lighthouse Foundation. He has appeared on the History Channel, the Travel Channel, Public TV, National Public Radio, and other places, speaking about lighthouses and other subjects. So please welcome Jeremy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Diane. It's great to be here today. I live up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, so it's a little bit of a ride, but I couldn't be happier to be here. I've been given a daunting task today, and that's to sum up the appeal of lighthouses in about 20 minutes. And I think I think probably most people here are lighthouse buffs, and you know that's almost impossible, but I'm going to do my best. So I better get started. I scripted my talk today because I want to keep it to the time I'm allotted. So I'm going to try to stick to my script. It's always hard to sum up the appeal of lighthouses in a brief time because lighthouses represent so many things to so many people. but I believe they have certain universal qualities that make them a very special class of structure and help to explain why they are so iconic in our culture. You see some words move across the screen there. There are many words that, I don't know if you can read those words on the back on the TV screen, but there are many words that can be applied to lighthouses and what they stand for. These are just a few of them. I'm sure all of you, when you think of a lighthouse, it conjures certain words in your mind that may or may not appear here. To sum it up, lighthouses represent all that is good in humanity. They were built for completely positive, altruistic reasons, to safeguard life and property. It's no accident that their symbolism is used by churches, schools, and all kinds of businesses. I would say the image of a lighthouse is one of the most, if not the most, used image in advertising. I think for most people, a picture of a lighthouse or even just the word lighthouse conjures all kinds of good feelings. This is Edward Rowe Snow. There are probably people in the audience here who remember him. He was a very popular historian, wrote a lot about the New England coast, wrote over 40 books. Used to be on Boston. I grew up in the Boston area. He used to be on radio and TV around there all the time when I was a kid. He passed away in 1982. I love this quote that he said in his 1945 book, Famous Lighthouses of New England. There's something about a lighted beacon that suggests hope and trust and appeals to the better instincts of mankind. He certainly understood the appeal of lighthouses as much or better than anyone. Lighthouses were one of his favorite subjects. His passion was an inspiration to me, and I would say the main reason I became interested in lighthouses. I blame him for this life I've been living for quite a few years now. Got to meet him a couple of times, too. I don't have time today to get deeply into the history of lighthouses, but I want to give you a quick overview that might help to explain their appeal. What happened there? Here we go. Okay. This is a quote that I think is probably familiar to everybody here. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In early human history, darkness was a very scary thing. Wild animals and our enemies could kill us more easily in the darkness. We hid in caves and waited for the light. The idea of light or fire cutting through the darkness is a common one in various cultures and religions. Here's a quote from the Quran. "We decked the nether heaven with lamps and rendered it inviolable." And a very familiar quote from a Chinese proverb. I'm sure everybody knows this one. "It's better to light a candle and to curse the darkness." Various versions of that have been around for a very long time. And I would say that pretty much sums up the reason for lighthouses, or the impetus for lighthouses. For many thousands of years, the availability of light governed our lives. We eventually learned to light fires to illuminate our caves or campgrounds at night. But as we started venturing out on the sea in boats, the idea of being out in the darkness was very scary. The earliest record of boats carrying goods for trade is around 3500 BC. The first navigators traveled mainly during the day. As mariners ventured out more at night, some learned to plot their course by the movement of the stars and constellations. But there was always the danger of running into hidden rocks, shoals, and other obstacles. The origins of the lighthouse go back to simple bonfires built on beaches and hillsides in many cultures around the world. The Greeks built braziers filled with fire. This is a drawing of one of them. And put them on hillsides at the entrances to harbors and along navigation routes. The Greeks also built some of the earliest true lighthouses, at least as early as the 5th century BC, basically columns surmounted by fire. And this is a lighthouse I'm sure you've probably all heard of, the Pharos of Alexandria, considered the world's first great lighthouse, built in the 3rd century BC in the harbor at Alexandria, Egypt, a city that had been founded by Alexander the Great. It was built of giant blocks of limestone and had a furnace at the top, with the fire possibly magnified by a giant mirror. Some people think it even used an early form of electricity. I'm not sure about that, but there are theories about that. It stood more than 300 feet tall and is regarded as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and pieces of it have been brought up from underwater in recent years. These are 2 of the early great lighthouses in the world, Eddystone Light in England on the left and the Cordouan Light in France on the right. England and France were leaders in lighthouse construction for many years. When the first lighthouse in North America was built, Well, obviously, skipping through the centuries pretty quickly here, but when the first lighthouse in North America was built in 1716, there were still only a handful of lighthouses in the world. And this is a drawing of the first lighthouse in North America, the first light at Little Brewster Island in Boston Harbor in 1716. First one was destroyed by the British in the Revolution, by the way, had to be rebuilt. The early economy of New England was based on fishing, whaling, and maritime trade, which is why the earliest lighthouses established after Boston were in important seaports like Nantucket, Newport, and New London. That's the New London Harbor Light, the oldest lighthouse in Connecticut on the bottom right there. There were 11 lighthouses in the colonies before the American Revolution. There were still shipwrecks, of course, due to storms and carelessness, but the presence of lighthouses and their keepers prevented countless disasters and helped to enable the expansion of maritime trade. One of the most important, if not the most important, advancements in the history of lighthouses was the invention of the Fresnel lens in France in the early 1820s. These glass lenses were constructed of many individual prisms that bent the light coming from a light source inside the lens into a powerful horizontal beam. The lenses were much more efficient than anything that had been used before. The first lighthouse in the world to use one was the Cordouan Lighthouse in France. The United States resisted them at first because of the higher cost, but eventually by the early 1860s, all American lighthouses used Fresnel lenses. The inventor, you see in the middle there, Augustin Jean Fresnel, died of tuberculosis in 1827. He was still in his 30s. He didn't live long enough to see his lenses used all over the world. His invention has had many applications besides lighthouses, car headlights, traffic lights, flashlights, theatrical lighting, among other things. I'll use the Fresnel principle, or used to before LED lights came along. Fresnel and his lenses are the subject of a wonderful recent book called A Short Bright Flash by Teresa Leavitt. Anybody who wants to know more, I highly recommend that book. I think it's one of the best lighthouse books ever. This is a fairly gruesome painting that some of you might be familiar with. You're probably wondering why I'm showing this. La Medusa by Géricault. The Medusa was a French frigate that was wrecked off the west coast of Africa in July 1817. There wasn't enough space in the lifeboats, so 147 people crowded onto a makeshift raft. They ran out of food, and 2 weeks later, there were only 15 people left alive on the raft when they were rescued. Two of the survivors wrote an account of their ordeal, and the public was captivated. Géricault's painting was introduced in 1819, and it was a huge hit. A reviewer wrote, quote, "The painter has assembled the most revolting aspects of despair, rage, hunger, death, and putrefaction," unquote. And he meant that as a compliment. Teresa Leavitt, in her book A Short Bright Flash, makes the case that this painting and the Fresnel lens represented two sides of the public's view of nature at that time. The painting showed nature as uncontrollable, with humans helpless under its power. Leavitt wrote that works of art like this invoke a mixture of fear and delight that comes from nature surpassing our ability to grasp it. Augustin Fresnel was also fascinated by nature, but he dreamed of controlling it and actually bending light to his own desires. Nature's power, scientists like Fresnel believed, could be funneled through the channels of science. Fresnel's invention gave people hope that shipwrecks and scenes like Géricault's painting could become a thing of the past. Of course, we'll never completely eradicate shipwrecks, but Fresnel's invention certainly helped toward that goal. There's a very vivid quote that describes a lighthouse in a storm from the best-selling novel The Light Between Oceans by M.L. Stedman. Probably some of you here have read that wonderful novel. She wrote, quote, "There are times when the ocean is not the ocean, not blue, not even water, but some violent explosion of energy and danger, fierceness on a scale only gods can summon." Pretty good quote. The struggle of the struggle of nature versus humans and their creations is at the heart of many of the most popular stories of lighthouses. This is a drawing of the first lighthouse at Minot's Ledge offshore near the south shore of Boston, off of Scituate, Massachusetts. It went into operation in January 1850, and just 15 months later, it collapsed into the sea during a terrible storm, taking the lives of two young assistant keepers. The keepers were celebrated as heroes. It's quite a famous story. It was called the Minot's Light Storm of 1851. The second lighthouse at Minot's Ledge took 5 years to build. I took this sunset picture last summer, with more than 1,000 granite blocks dovetailed together. It's 114 feet tall. It's considered a landmark of American civil engineering. The lighthouse has taken incredible battering in storms over the years, but it still stands tall. And it still shows its famous 1-4-3 flash. Some of you are probably aware of that. Somebody decided it flashes once, pause, flashes 4 times, pause, flashes 3 times. Somebody a long time ago decided that stood for I love you, so it's commonly known as the I love you light, or the lover's light. This is an amazing photo of mine. It's light during the blizzard of 1978, February 1978, pictured by Kevin Cole of the Boston Herald. This won some awards, I believe. And again, that lighthouse is 114 feet tall, so that wave is around 100, going around 100 feet up. It's amazing to see. I've seen it at other lighthouses where sometimes the waves will just hit the rocks around the lighthouse and just explode up in the air. This next picture might be the most, well, wait a second. Nope, I'm not quite, I'm skipping ahead in my script here, sorry. This is Whaleback Lighthouse in Kittery, Maine. I took this picture a couple of years ago. This was built in 1872. It's another example of a sturdily built granite wave-swept tower on an offshore ledge. The first lighthouse built at that location in 1830 was considered the first successful wave-swept lighthouse in the United States. It's 70 feet tall, and I took this picture of Whaleback Lighthouse during a storm in April 2007. And that wave, the spray from that wave is going up probably 80 feet in the air. I missed one wave. A friend of mine was also taking pictures at the same time, and he caught one where the wave is twice as high as the lighthouse. So it's incredible to see the power of the ocean like that. This next picture is probably the most famous lighthouse photo ever taken. This is the La Gemante Lighthouse off the Brittany coast of France during a storm in December 1989. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. If you look closely, you can see the keeper in the doorway there. Can you all see him? I guess I can't use the pointer on the TV screen, but I think you can see him. This was taken by the French photographer Jean Guichard from a helicopter. The keeper heard the helicopter and went outside expecting to see the helicopter that was supposed to come and take him and the other keeper off the lighthouse because the conditions were so bad. But it wasn't, it was a photographer. Contrary to urban legend, he did not die seconds after this picture was taken. He got back inside the lighthouse just fine. I think he got a little wet, though. If anything sums up the story of lighthouses and keepers against nature, this photo certainly does. Of course, we sometimes lose our battles with nature. As the keeper says in the script for Judy Dworin's dance piece, if it comes to a choice between the strength of man-made things and the strength of the sea, there's only one answer. The loss of the first mine, its light, was one example of losing our battle with nature. This is the Whale Rock Lighthouse at the entrance of the West Passage of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. It was built in the 1881, and that is on the right. There's Walter Eberly in his wedding picture with his wife. Walter Eberly was an assistant keeper at this lighthouse in the late 1930s. And it's a very sad story. This is what was left of that lighthouse after the hurricane of 1938, great hurricane that did such damage on the south coast of New England. The body of Walter Eberly was never found. He was 40 years old and left 5 children. Pieces of the lighthouse are still lying underwater there. This is the Old Orchard Shoal Lighthouse in New York Harbor. I took this picture a few years ago. And this is all that was left of Old Orchard Shoal Light after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. One of the positive things about the automation of lighthouses is that nobody has to live at isolated offshore lighthouses like this during major storms anymore. There's a lot of negative aspects to automation of lighthouses, but that's definitely a positive one. There's often great heroism in the struggle of lighthouse keepers against nature. This is Abby Burgess, daughter of the keeper at the Matinicus Rock Light Station. Some of you might know the children's book, Keep the Lights Burning, Abby, that was based on her. That light station is far offshore in Maine's Penobscot Bay, and you can see in that old postcard there it has two lighthouse towers. In 1857, when Abby was 16 years old, she was left in charge of the station when her father, the keeper, went away for supplies. Again, 16 years old. Not only was she expected to keep the 2 lighthouses lit at night, she also had to take care of her invalid mother and 2 younger siblings. A storm hit just after her father left. The island was flooded, and Abby had to move her mother and siblings into one of the lighthouse towers to keep them safe. There was a series of storms and high seas that prevented her father from returning for just about a full month. And never once did the lights go out at night during that time, and Abby kept everyone in the family safe. It's just an amazing story. She was celebrated as a national heroine. She eventually married a lighthouse keeper, and she became an official assistant keeper herself. There were quite a few women lighthouse keepers in the United States. She died at the age of 53, and a small lighthouse was later placed on her gravesite by Edward Rossneau, the historian I showed you before. Diane referred in her introduction to Ida Lewis, famous woman keeper at Newport, Rhode Island. As I said, there were many women lighthouse keepers. Most often they were wives or daughters of male keepers, and when the keeper died or became incapacitated, sometimes the wife or daughter would get the job because they already knew how to do it. One of the most famous, again, was Ida Lewis at Lime Rock in Newport Harbor. She was credited with saving as many as 30 lives over more than 50 years there, and was celebrated as a national heroine. President Ulysses S. Grant came to visit her, got his feet wet, and he said, "I'd get wet up to my armpits to visit Ida Lewis." I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but I want to talk a little bit about the dark side of lighthouses. I think people primarily see the lighthouse as a positive icon, but there's no denying that they have another side. There's something about lighthouses, especially remote offshore ones, that ignite our imaginations. We think about the isolation and loneliness of the keepers who lived at them, and we imagine what life was like through all kinds of weather and harsh conditions. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the many writers who recognized the dark side of lighthouses. When Poe died at the age of 40 in 1849, he left behind fragmentary notes for a story called The Lighthouse. It concerned a solitary lighthouse keeper at a wave-swept tower off the coast of England in the late 1700s. Because he died before he finished the story, we'll never know what creepy fate Poe had in mind for the keeper. Around 10 years ago, a writer named Christopher Conlon had a number of horror and science fiction writers complete Poe's story in their own styles. And you see the cover there. The result was the book Poe's Lighthouse, which is out of print, but if you can find it, it's pretty interesting. Lighthouses continue to inspire writers as a potentially creepy setting for stories of horror, madness, and murder. On the upper left, you see a Classics Illustrated version of Ray Bradbury's story, The Foghorn, which was made into the movie The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And on the upper right is Storm of the Century by Stephen King. Both the book and the TV miniseries version had a prominent lighthouse. Unfortunately, there's a Canadian lighthouse on the cover of the book. Well, what can you do? Lighthouses have also appealed to many filmmakers over the years as a setting for horror stories. The Fog was set at a California lighthouse, and on the right there, that's a still from The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the 1950s horror movie with a monster that came out of the ocean attacking the lighthouse. And if you've seen it, you might remember it actually knocks over the lighthouse. It's a pretty memorable scene. This is New London Ledge Light, of course, right here in Connecticut. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that a little more today. Susan with the New London Maritime Society is very involved with it. Many lighthouses feature ghost stories as part of their legends and lore. New London Ledge Light has one of the most famous lighthouse ghost stories in the country, the story of Ernie, the lovelorn keeper, who supposedly leaped to his death after his wife ran away with a ferry captain in the 1930s. Many people have had strange experiences at the lighthouse, and Ernie is often blamed. While I don't think the legend of a keeper committing suicide is true, I do have an open mind about the paranormal. In fact, I took part in an overnight investigation at this lighthouse with an investigation group a few years ago. In any case, stories like this are an integral part of the fabric of lighthouse history and lore. So many lighthouses have ghost stories. Whether you like them or not, there's no getting away from them. This is Crazy Judson, Theodore or Crazy Judson, a keeper at Stratford Point Light in Connecticut. There are other legends related to lighthouses besides ghosts, and Diane mentioned this man. He earned the nickname Crazy because some of the things he reported to the press. First, he reported that he had seen a 300-foot sea serpent with pea-green whiskers passing Stratford Point. And then a few years later, he said he had seen as many as 15 mermaids frolicking in the waves off Stratford Point. He said he almost caught one of them. He said she hissed at him and managed to get away. He said she had a foul temper. And he said he managed to salvage her oyster shell hairbrush. He used to show the hairbrush to people, and they'd say, oh, this looks like an ordinary hairbrush. And he always said it's because the mermaids dive into shipwrecks and find belongings, and she brought up the hairbrush from a shipwreck. He said the mermaids were a grand sight. And it said that to his dying day, Judson's friend were never able to get him to retract the mermaid tale. And by the way, that mermaid, I know that mermaid on the right is a real mermaid because I took that picture myself at Portsmouth Harbor Light, New Hampshire, near my home. And I won't go, I'll just leave it like that. But I will say that a mermaid figures very prominently in the Judy Dworin dance piece, and I think we have the person who plays the mermaid right here with us today. So I hope some of you get to see that and learn more about mermaids and lighthouse keepers. When you add all these elements together, I think it's obvious why lighthouses have been such a favorite subject for art and photography. Pictures of lighthouses often have great resonance that goes way beyond mere pretty pictures. A couple of famous artists who included lighthouses in their paintings. On the left, Fitzhenry Lane, a great Gloucester maritime artist in the 1800s. And on the right, Winslow Homer, who spent a summer with the lighthouse keeper at 10 Pound Island in Gloucester Harbor, and that's the lighthouse that's shown in that painting. And Edward Hopper, one of the most famous and popular American artists of the 1920s and 30s, painted many scenes of the Maine coast. And one of his favorite subjects was the so-called two lights in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. And that's what you see in these paintings. The one on the lower right is especially famous, the light at two lights, it's called. He liked to explore light and shadow and architectural shapes, and I think his paintings often have a kind of a melancholy feel. Again, they're not simple, pretty pictures. Not that there's anything wrong with pretty pictures. Speaking of melancholy, the famous artist Andrew Wyeth painted scenes of lighthouses. His paintings certainly have a melancholy feel. On the left, that's Pemaquid Point Light in Maine. On the right, Tennant's Harbor Light on Southern Island in Midcoast, Maine. Andrew Wyeth and his wife Betsy actually bought the Tennant's Harbor Lighthouse. After it had gone out of commission, the government sold it, and the Wyeths bought it, and they converted the fog bell tower into his studio. And Andrew Wyeth, of course, passed away a few years ago, and his son Jamie now lives at the lighthouse and works in the bell tower. And that's one of his many paintings, one of the many paintings Jamie Wyeth has done of that lighthouse. I could go on here, but I've got to wrap things up. When I see a lighthouse, I see much more than a simple building. I see the people who kept the light basically devoting their lives to it. I see the ships and lives that it saved, the daily dedication of the keepers, and the drama that swirled around it. Lighthouses are much more than brick and mortar, and I think this quote by the 19th century historian Samuel Adams Drake pretty much sums things up pretty well. So with that, I'll thank you, and we'll move on to the next part of our...
On stage.
Okay.
Join us. Let's start our panel. Want to come right up? Our panelists can just join us right now. That'd be great. And some interesting stories. I suspect that if you were a lighthouse keeper stuck out on a rock like that for long periods of time, you'd see mermaids too. So I'm not going to discredit that. Let me introduce our other panelists to you now. Judy Dworin, who is to my far right, founded the Judy Dworin Performance Project in 1989. Judy directs the Bridging Boundaries Outreach Program for those affected by incarceration, and that includes an 8-year residency at the York Correctional Institute for Women in Niantic. Judy established the dance program at Trinity College and chaired the Department of Theater and Dance for many years. Judy's new project, as you've been hearing, is called Lighthouse, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that in the next few minutes. I also want to introduce someone who has done an extraordinary job in preserving some lighthouses. Susan Tamulevich is the executive director of the New London Maritime Society. Susan oversaw the adoption of the New London Harbor Light, the one that we just saw a picture of, and Race Rock Light Station. And in June, the Maritime Society is going to take over the New London Ledge Lighthouse. This is an unprecedented accomplishment, according to the National Park Service, for a single organization to take possession and care for 3 separate lighthouses. So, Susan, very, very happy to have you with us. Judy, I want to start with you and ask you, what inspired you to do a project called Lighthouse?
Well, initially, Lighthouse, its first version was in 1986. It was a piece that I made after my father died. And it was kind of a tribute to him and asked the question, how do how do we keep connection with someone who's no longer physically present? And lighthouses as a metaphor of lights reaching out in the dark seem to be an appropriate metaphor for that piece. This time around, which is 25 years later, and in celebration of our 25th anniversary, renewed the idea of lighthouses as, again, ambassadors of human connection and how we maintain human connection in a world that's being increasingly driven by technology.
I want to explore some of those themes a little bit more, but Susan, I would suspect that some of what Judy just said probably resonates with you.
Oh, yes, and we're in a big Coast Guard and boating town, and everyone on the water respects the lighthouses. You mentioned that quote about all that you can see from New London. Well, they're there for reasons. There are ledges, there are islands, there are currents. You know, you need these aids to navigation. And even today, with the, GPS, all of that, I know that the captain to the Fisher's Island ferry says they always focus on New London Harbor Light when they come in. And last year, we actually restored the outside. We repainted it so it was shrouded in a black tent. And they said, we can't wait till that's gone because we can't see it, with the trees. So people use them, and it's been so gratifying to see how much people love them. When we do our efforts, we do this much, and the public does a tremendous amount too.
Jeremy, it's interesting that Susan mentioned that, because one of the things that you and I talked about on the telephone before this was that people frequently will ask you, are lighthouses still navigational aids? What's the answer to that in New England?
Yeah, I get asked that all the time, and the simple answer is yes and no, I always say. But as Susan said, they are still used. Most lighthouses are still official federal aids to navigation. Some have been turned off. Some have been, some of the visibility has been lessened with some of them. They might not be seen, they might have been, maybe years ago they were seen 25 miles, maybe they're only seen 10 or 15 miles now. But most of them are still automated aids to navigation. There are no more lighthouse keepers in this country because all the lighthouses are automated, except for one lighthouse. There is a keeper, if we want to get into that. But
The one in Stratford, Connecticut?
Nope.
There is one in Stratford.
No, the only one that has an official keeper is Boston
Okay.
Harbor. But anyway, as Susan said, the mariner, you ask any boater, whether it's a lobsterman, fisherman, or ferry captain or whatever, they'll pretty much unanimously say that they do look at the lighthouses as a confirmation. For one thing, it doesn't hurt to have tangible, visible things like lighthouses and buoys in the water that confirm what your GPS is telling you. But in addition to that, GPS and other electronics can fail. We all know, computers can crash and electronics can go down. So lighthouses are still an important backup. If the government didn't feel they were needed for navigation anymore, they'd turn them all off tomorrow to save some money.
There actually is a lighthouse with a keeper in Stratford, although he's technically not a keeper. I guess he's a U.S. Coast Guard officer, and he does do tours of the lighthouse.
Living in Stratford Point, right. The only one that has what is called an official keeper still employed by the federal government is Boston Light. There are people living at some of the lighthouses and sometimes referred to as keepers, so it depends on your semantics.
I was going to say, but it's more than the light, the foghorns. Especially in New London, we hear those foghorns all the time. And now that we're responsible, in a sense, for 3 of them, I get the reports when it's out. And people love, somebody emailed me on well, I shouldn't say because I was in my car, but from Fisher's Island saying that, the foghorn has been out for a little while, but I was so glad to hear it this morning. And our foghorn at Harbor Light, the one down more or less on the shore in New London, used to drive Eugene O'Neill's mother. I guess that's what did it.
It's mentioned in one of his plays.
That's what drove her to drink?
And then when they built Ledge Light, 1909, which is, quite a while after Harbor Light, they moved it offshore. But they have a a foghorn and race rock. And that's important because light can't penetrate the fog, but the horn sound waves do.
Susan, tell us about the National Lighthouse Preservation Act, which is really how you came to adopt, if you will, these 3 lighthouses that are now about to be in your care.
Well, not just us. We have Nick here, and many, these buildings, for a while, when they were deemed surplus, were sold, and people in the Coast Guard or Navy who had, spent their lives relying upon these were upset, and one of our visitors said lighthouses are in America what castles are to people in Europe. As you said, symbols of protection and safety, and to see a lighthouse turned into some little fish restaurant or something was upsetting to some people. And I know that some of the officials actually at the GSA in Boston were responsible for writing the legislation, the 2000 Lighthouse Protection Act, which means that if a historic lighthouse is deemed surplus, they have to offer it first, I believe, to a municipality. So for instance, New London, they would offer to New London, or nonprofits. And the nonprofits are a little bit of a second step. And then any nonprofit, not just us, because we know we had to compete with nonprofits from all over, can submit really lengthy, elaborate financial plans and use plans and preservation plans, a huge binder you end up with, to the National Park Service to review. And then they can select a group. Now, suppose no group comes forward, because you might say, crazy, look at those lighthouses, no one could afford it. Mm-hmm. Then, if they can't find a proper owner, or like with Little Gull a few years ago, the nonprofit did not fulfill its obligations to the federal government, which include, because they're owned federally, access by the public and preservation work to keep it in good shape and functioning. If the nonprofit fails, it's offered for auction to the highest bidder. Mm-hmm. And we have experience with that too, with Little Gull. And that was one of the first real experiences we had, where we had this group called Lighthouse Kids. All the kids in New London learn about lighthouses, and they adopted Harbor Light when we first got that lighthouse. They all wrote letters. But when it got in the paper, people all around Long Island Sound wrote letters to the GSA. No, don't go to an auction. Here's a nonprofit willing to take on Little Gull, 1804, very old, important, beautiful lighthouse. Well, the federal government has a path they have to stick to, and it went to an auction. So then we said, okay, we're going to bid. We need money. And in 48 hours, we raised $165,000 from people we didn't even know. Wow. And we were in the lead for 10 minutes. And this was reserving $15,000 for closing fees, because we have to be so careful. It sold for $365,000, which was a record, but that's been surpassed now.
And so it's privately owned now?
Privately owned, which means we don't have access. Mm-hmm. Who knows? They have obligations, but they own it.
I just wanted to mention that if anyone in the audience would like to make a comment or ask a question, please raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and Bill will bring a microphone over to you so that we can hear you. But don't be shy. If anybody wants to talk, please raise your hand, and we'll go right to you. So if anybody out there has anything, you might have to wave a little bit to get my attention, because I'm really interested in what's going on here. But Judy, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that Susan just talked about, and that Jeremy mentioned in his discussion, which are some of the themes that emerge from lighthouses, and some of the iconography that people associate with them. That must come out in your performance.
Yeah, I think that one of the strongest things that Jeremy said was the fact that lighthouses really represent everything that's good, that they're there to help and to protect, and also they're there to stand up to nature, to not so much in an antagonistic way, but as a sense of strength and grounding. And I think that aspect of lighthouses comes across very much in the piece that I'm doing. In this piece, there are a bunch of shipwrecked survivors who have come from the world that we live in that's so technology-driven, and who now no longer can use their cell phones and have to readapt completely to a world and almost start from the beginning in terms of how do we really create relationship amongst each other in that situation as we used to before, you know, and so it really explores relationship, and the lighthouse keeper is kind of the keeper of wisdom because he's kind of gotten it along the way, and I think that the inspiration of lighthouses and the ocean kind of permeates the piece in terms of the text, which is written by a poet named Marjorie Agassi, and this cello and vocals that an original sound score, so that it creates a world. And I think that lighthouses create a world for us, and they really charge our imagination. And I think that it takes that and extends it into a story that somehow encourages us in a very gentle way, I think, about how we really need to think about connection to each other.
Jeremy or Susan, tell me a little bit about how lighthouse keepers would get their jobs. And why would somebody apply for one, particularly if you're not, you know, if you're on the shore or you're on an island close to shore, that's one thing. But if you're just out there on a rock, out in the middle, you know, that to me just seems, no wonder some of them go mad, and no wonder there are so many horror stories about them, right?
Some of them did. Kind of depends on what era you're talking about. In the early days of lighthouses in this country, up until a very efficient federal lighthouse board was formed in 1852. Before that, it was all favoritism and nepotism, and it all depended on who you knew and what political party you supported.
Well, and also it was for veterans. You know, if you had been a celebrated veteran, sometimes it was an official appointment, and it was an honor.
Quite a few Civil War veterans got lighthouse keeper jobs. Even some, there were a number of one-legged and one-armed lighthouse keepers after the Civil War, amazingly enough. But they did pay more attention to qualifications later on in the 1800s, and they had to have maritime experience. And after a while, they had to pass a civil service exam. And then the Coast Guard took over. It was civilian before 1939. It was generally known as the Lighthouse Service. It was federal, but there were civilians. And then the Coast Guard took over lighthouses in 1939. So the keepers after that were Coast Guard. And gradually the lights were automated over the decades that followed that.
Any other questions? Anyone want to make a comment? Or just wait for the microphone to come to you. Right over here, Bill.
Thank you. I have a question for Jeremy. I totally new in this amazing subject. I would like to know what language does the lighthouses speak? I mean, how did they communicate with people that understand the sign?
The lighthouses, how do people interpret the lights or
Yes.
that sort of thing?
Is it a language? Is it a code? What is it?
I'm going to say one thing before we get to that, and then you can answer that question. Because we're at the Custom House Maritime Museum in New London, I have to give a plug for that. And it was built in 1833, 35, and we have all these original letters. And beginning from the very early days of this country, and probably even when it was a colony, it was the customs official, was the federal presence in the area, and customs actually provided all the supplies, built the lighthouses, built the light ships over in Mystique, and posted filled the jobs. Yeah. So we have letters about how they selected their lighthouse keepers, and about a wife and no ink taking over the job when everybody was opposed to a woman having the lighthouse keeper's job. So it's a good, there's a lot of primary material at the Custom House if anyone is interested in that. But you go ahead with the flashes.
That's a really good point. Yeah, the local customs collectors were the managers of the local lighthouses all over the early U.S. But to answer your question, every light in a lighthouse in a close geographic region, like say the New London Harbor region, every navigational light has to have what they call a different characteristic, either a different colored light. Some lighthouses have white lights, some have red, some have green, and or a different flash that people can recognize. So you might have a light that flashes once every 10 seconds. You might have another light in a lighthouse nearby that flashes once every 30 seconds. The mariners need to be able to see those lights from their boat or ship and be able to tell them apart very easily. And by recognizing the characteristics of those lights in the region, it helps tell them their own position. The lights, the characteristics are identified on nautical charts, so they can look on a chart and see which light is which. There's also light lists that are published every year. The fog signals that Susan was talking about, they used to have fog bells at a lot of lighthouses. A lot of them still have horns, fog horns. Those also have different characteristics. So one might blast once every 10 seconds, another one might blast twice every 20 seconds or whatever it is. So mariners can tell those apart as well in the fog, and it helps tell them their position.
And at Race Rock, I think it's every 3 seconds. It's like a crazy foghorn.
Just to add to that, I think that aside from their function in guiding, they also become a kind of pulse of life for people that live around them. I know I was talking to somebody about this when in making the piece who lives in Mystique, and he was able to see 3 lighthouses from the roof of this house he lived in, and all of a sudden, I think it was on Montauk, they withdrew the power of the light so that it didn't have the same throw, and all of a sudden he felt completely off center because in some way his life had begun to be organized around the rhythm of those sounds and the light itself, and I think that it has that broader sense to it.
There's always a lot of complaints when lights are changed or fog signals are turned off or changed or whatever. People are so ingrained in people's lives, they have trouble adjusting.
Yeah.
One of the things I was wondering about, Susan, is this is a tremendous amount of responsibility. How do you pay for the care, the upkeep, the preservation? I was at New London Ledge Lighthouse a number of years ago when another group had tried to adopt it, and it was pretty much a mess inside.
Well, there is a wonderful, we'll use New London Ledge for an example. Yes, that organization in one guise or another has been taking care of it for a couple of decades. But about 5 years ago, the Gipsteins kind of reinvigorated. They moved to Groton, which and New London Ledge is actually technically in Groton. I know they'll appreciate that distinction. And the Gipsteins kind of reinvigorated this group, and they have done a tremendous job on the lighthouse. It's all cleaned up, repainted on the inside. They're installing new windows and a new floor over the old tiles, and have a film. Todd worked for National Geographic, so he's made an excellent film about the lighthouse, the story, and exhibits. And the fact is, if you offer these opportunities, people are only too happy to volunteer their skills, their materials, their history, and their actual labor. So we did, I don't know, we have our hands full in New London, and our president, George Bogacci, said, well, sorry, we've had the lighthouse for 2 years, we've got to paint it. It seemed very fast to me, but okay, we'll paint it. We had a press conference in the end of June 2013. The very next morning, I'll tell you, nobody came. You weren't there. Nobody came to our press conference except for Patch and The Day, and they put little articles in, but it was almost no one. The very next day, less than 24 hours, we got a call from the Carpenters Union secretary. She said, we have carpenters, we have scaffolding, we have painters, we'll donate everything. What do you need? It was probably $400,000 worth of donations.
Wow.
Within 24 hours. So when you have that kind of support, you feel like you're just watching from the sidelines. It has its own life. And that was a tremendous lesson, I think, for us. And those same people want to give the tours. We have a couple of our tour guides here today. They want to help. They do anything they can because people love the lighthouses.
Are these the tour guides right here?
Well, these two women.
Right here. Bill, would you bring the microphone up here? Tell me a little bit, just if you hand it to
Margaret
me.
and Carolyn. Margaret Palmer and Carolyn Lewis, who actually runs New London Local Boating. They're excellent.
Okay, tell me a little bit about what you talk about when you're giving a tour of the lighthouse.
Well, we just start off with saying that whether the people are local or not, and if they're not local, we'll just say you're on the River Thames, and it's spelled Thames. And if you were in England, it would be spelled, it would be the Thames, and it would be spelled Thames. And then we go on and say, why? And you tell them.
Well, because when the Hanoverian kings came to England, German has no THs. So the Thames became the Thames. And
But what do you tell about the lighthouses?
Oh, well, we tell we can actually see the 3 lighthouses without any kind of magnification or anything like that, and so the people start asking us questions, and we have to like quiet them down a little bit and tell them that we're going to be seeing the oldest and the tallest over here, and then we're going to see this the newest and the shortest over here, and then in the middle we're going to be seeing ledge light, and they get all excited, and then we have a whole spiel, and it depends upon whether their eyes glaze over, whether I stop talking and let them talk. And
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the different sizes and styles, because the architecture of the lighthouses is really different, although I know that the government did build more than one in each style, because I remember meeting the gentleman who I think bought the lighthouse in Noank,
Yes.
and he remembered a lighthouse in Greenwich when he was a little boy that looked just like it. And I've seen, some that seem to mirror each other. But those 3 that you're talking about there, they're dramatically different from each other.
Yeah, and actually that's another great thing about New London, is that all these lighthouses, and there are quite a few, they're all very distinct styles, and they run the whole span, as Margaret said, oldest, tallest to youngest, smallest, everyone's favorite, quirky, ledge light, but Little Gold, most beautiful cylindrical 1804 lighthouse, Little Dumpling on the top of that little island, Race Rock, oh, so exciting, built over 6 years, 7 years by Captain T.A. Scott out of New London. They're all really different and fascinating. And the spark plugs, Latimer's, Orient Point, and no offense to our tours, which are great, if you want to, just take a ferry out of New London. You'll go right by all these beautiful lighthouses, and we do tours at sunset. We do them in the dark, and unlike something like a monument, they're not lit at night. They're black, and then the light goes on, and that's the signature you see, and it's really very thrilling, even for boaters, because they don't usually sail at night. So it's a popular tour, and it's another whole way to experience your harbor.
Anyone with a question or comment? Over here, Bill, right over there on the end. Right there. So raise your hand, please. Bill's trying to read your mind.
She was. Hi, I wondered how you keep relations with other states. As an example, I'm from New York, and I'm sure you're familiar with Tibbetts Point Lighthouse. Is there relationships kept between the different states? Or I heard federal, but...
Want to take that?
Sure. Are you talking about in the preservation world? People involved in lighthouse preservation communicating with each other?
Yes.
Right. There's some of that. There's probably not as much as there could or should be. There have been regional lighthouse conferences in the past. There haven't been any in a while, maybe because of the economy not being as good as it was some years ago when they used to happen more often. But there are some regional lighthouse organizations. There's the American Lighthouse Foundation based in Maine that is involved with about 20 different lighthouses spread along from the Connecticut up to the northern Maine coast, and has members all over the country. There's the U.S. Lighthouse Society based in Washington State that has membership all over the country. So that's a way, and there's other, there's a thing called the Atlantic Lighthouse Council also that kind of, is like a clearinghouse sort of for information for all lighthouse groups that want to take part in it. I mean, there are ways that happens, but again, it's easy to get caught up in your own world. And
Jeremy, would you, I want you to tell a story about a story that I've heard over the years, and I don't know how many of you have heard it, but about the gentleman that used to visit all the lighthouses at Christmas time.
Oh,
and
sure.
bring gifts.
I almost had that in my presentation, but there's just too much to get in there, but I'm glad, thank you for asking that. The flying Santa to lighthouses, that's actually a very famous thing. That, I don't know if anybody here knows about it, but the flying Santa is a tradition that goes back to 1929. A pilot in Maine named Bill Winkapaw who really he was a pioneer pilot, really, and he appreciated lighthouses. He sometimes would, use lights of lighthouses to help guide him to his airport. So he, as a way of showing appreciation, in 1929, he would fly a seaplane over the Penobscot Bay in Maine, and he started, at Christmas time, dropping presents out of his plane for the keepers and their families as a way of saying thank you. It was hugely appreciated, so he started expanding the flights, and then in the 1930s, Edward Rowe Snow, the historian I talked about, who was an inspiration to me, got involved. He ended up taking over as the Flying Santa eventually. He did flights from 1936 to through 1980. He died in 1982. It's still continued today by a nonprofit, the Friends of Flying Santa. Even though all the lights are automated and there's really not traditional lighthouse keepers, the helicopters now land at Coast Guard stations, and presents are given to children of Coast Guard families as a way of showing appreciation for the work that those
and
families do.
that lighthouse in Stratford is one of the places where they
Yes.
do that. All the Coast Guard officers and come with their kids, and it's a big party, and it's a great helicopter that lands. The kids' eyes are bugging out.
Oh, it's wonderful.
It's pretty amazing. And when they see Santa in the front seat of the helicopter waving out the window,
Yeah.
it's extremely cool. Anybody else with a comment or a question? Because we're almost going to get ready to wrap up here, so I want to give somebody an opportunity if you'd like. Wait, we need you to get the microphone. We need you to say that on the mic.
I know that there's a program that it's like a passport book that you collect lighthouses and
Yeah.
you go and get stamps from all of the lighthouses.
Yeah, it's the U.S. Lighthouse Society, based in Washington State, does that. So if you go to, I think it's uslighthousesociety.org, I believe is their website, you can actually buy the passports online or at some of the lighthouse. Do you carry them?
We do, yeah, we actually sell those in our shop, and we stamp for Harbor Light, and we are tough. People always send us $5 and they say, can you send me a stamp? I say, no, you have to prove you were there. Because, it's supposed to be a passport.
But I'll keep your $5.
Well, what are you going to do? But it's an honor, and then you can get a special badge if you get a certain number.
Fill up your passport, yeah.
And I think it's really a fun thing. A lot of people love to travel and see these lighthouses. Jeremy gives tours all over the place. We have tours in New London, and we're going to go to Portsmouth this summer, right? And
I hope so.
And work with Jeremy, and we're going to work with Nick, right? And it's actually, you're talking about the links between places. One of our lighthouses is in New York, and the people who are involved with lighthouses are the nicest people you're ever going to meet. And all have the same problems as you, Jeremy, enumerated: the wind, the storms, everything. So there's a lot to share, and people who volunteer with your lighthouse get it in pretty good shape. They would love to go next to Ledge or next to Race Rock. They're dying to get into Race Rock, and just to say they were there, but to help also. It's when you're on the water, there are no state divisions. It's all.
Well, I know in Norwalk, where I live, the lighthouse was taken over by a nonprofit that was formed specifically to take over and maintain that lighthouse. And they do all kinds of things, ranging from tours to you can take a ferry out there.
Oh, yeah, Norwalk
They
is
have a
great.
little vineyard, and they used to have a lighthouse keeper every summer who would just spend the summer there, and his or her job was to give the tours. But they lived in sort of a lean-to kind of a building. But now you can go out there and have lobster dinners on certain nights of the week, and they had music, and it's really quite wonderful. We're going to wrap up, but Judy, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of give us a little bit more of an overview of your performance piece and when and where we can see it.
Thank you. It's on April 17th and 18th, and it's at the Etna Theater at the Wadsworth Atheneum. And I'm just going back to Jeremy talking about the art inspirations. The Edward Hopper Captain Stroud's House, which is a very, very beautiful painting of the Portland light, is going to be on special exhibit, and Erin Monroe, who's the curator, will be giving a talk before the opening of the piece on the 17th. And Marjorie Agassi, who's written some incredibly beautiful poetry based on the piece, will be. We've made a little booklet of her poems that will be available. The piece itself, I think, will take you into the world of the lighthouse. All the things that we've talked about in very specific ways, you'll experience in a kind of metaphoric world that's created for you, and in which there's balance and there's struggle, and struggle with each other as humans and struggle with the elements and it resolves in, I think that Lighthouse is very much about a journey through life, which I think that in some ways lighthouses themselves in some ways represent. So the mermaid is sitting in the audience right there. There is a mermaid.
Mermaid, would you raise
Melissa,
your
you can
hand?
raise your hand.
Okay.
And
Could we see your
and
tail,
there is
please?
a very beautiful and there is a very beautiful way in which Melissa is both a mermaid and also the spirit of the ocean. And we have managed a storm with 2 ropes. So you'll have to come and see how that happens. And Haley, who's sitting here too, is one of the people who land on this island and really have to relearn how to live. And in some ways, I think we all need that lesson. So, so I invite you to take part in it and see what you come out with.
And by the way, congratulations on your 25th anniversary of the Judy Dworin Performance Project. I wanted to ask you about an event that you hold, Susan. I know in the summer you'll be holding your Sentinels on the Sound celebration. I'm going to let you have a last word on that. Tell us about it.
Well, it's a crazy thing. I told you this is the 5th year. First year, one weekend, Jeremy was our big attraction. Everything packed in a big weekend. When it poured on Sunday, we were so happy because we were so exhausted with the boat trips. Now we have this wonderful volunteers. We brought more than 1,000 people out to see the lighthouses. Not in big boats, in boats just 6 passengers. It's very intimate and personal. We won Best Lighthouse Tours last year from Yankee Magazine.
Great.
And we offer a variety of experiences. In fact, not only can you see a number of lighthouses from New London, but it's a true lighthouse hub. Elizabeth Wood, who couldn't be here today, has a great little lighthouse museum in Stonington. The Coast Guard Museum right in New London has a great exhibit on lighthouses. We have one at the Custom House. And like I said, you can take the ferries to Block Island and see that very famous, beautiful lighthouse. It's no problem. You can walk there from the museum to the, walk from place to place. It's all a lot of fun, and
How do people get more information about it?
NL, as in New London, maritimesociety.org.
Okay.
And it'll be everywhere because we do have quite a nice following now, and it's fun. It's just fun.
It is fun.
Yeah.
It is fun. I would definitely recommend it. Jeremy, I'm going to let you have the last word, and my question really to you is, in the years that you have been researching lighthouses and traveling and writing about them, what's the thing that has impressed you the most over perhaps what's changed since you started doing this? Because 10 books, it's been a lot of work.
The preservation, the whole preservation world is just always evolving, and it's been really interesting to watch, and it's going to continue to be interesting to watch. I'm not worried about the lighthouses that are under an organization like Susan's. The ones that are fairly easy to access, easy for people to visit or to see from a boat, at least, without too much trouble. I'm not worried about those so much, but some of the more remote ones are in real trouble. So there is a danger. We're going to lose some more lighthouses, but it's an interesting time for sure, and it's great to see so many dedicated people so involved.
What can we
very
do to
encouraging.
try to make sure that doesn't happen to those lighthouses that are endangered?
It's tough. I mean, some of them are several miles offshore on rocks, and as much as I love those lighthouses, it's pretty daunting to take them on. So my hope is some of them are going to private owners, and some of them have worked out great with private owners. That brings to mind, I just want to mention we do have a private owner of a lighthouse right in the front row here. Nick Korstad, who owns a lighthouse in Fall River, Mass., the Borden Flats Light, and it's one of the lighthouses where you can stay overnight.
All right, I'm
So-
going to actually let him have the last word. Phil, bring the microphone. How did we not find out about this till the end of the program?
I was really hoping to get it in there.
Go ahead, Nick. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit.
I'm Nick. I own the Borden Flats Lighthouse in Fall River. And thankfully, it is a spark plug style lighthouse, but I'm only about 800 feet offshore. But when you describe these stories, there's days where it seems like it's 6-7 miles offshore, the waves and everything. And I'm the one that has to deal with, I'm the only one that maintains it, so I don't have volunteers. And the place has to be painted every season. And this year we had that awesome New England winter. The whole bay froze over. And so I was out there looking, and the sheet pile foundation, the 38 hurricane actually really damaged that lighthouse. So so they added a wider foundation. So just seeing like chunks of it ripped off, it's just, you're like, I have to go out here, and it's expensive. And so
What possessed you to buy it?
I always wanted to be a lighthouse keeper. And so when I was a little kid, they took away all the lighthouse keeper jobs, and so you have to buy one at auction. So as he was saying, most of the really remote ones are the ones that go up for public sale.
Yeah.
And I'm working really hard to try and obtain Stratford Shoal Lighthouse, because a lot of times when they do go up for sale, these people buy them as a show-off piece, and they don't have the funds. It's every time I go out to Bourne Flats, it's like going to an ATM and it's asking for like $100, and the private owners. This is my job, you know. This is what I do full time.
And do I understand that people can stay over at the
Yep.
lighthouse?
And the main reason for overnight stay program was the Lighthouse Preservation Act. The main thing is that they want them open to the public. When they are sold into private sector, all the requirements basically fall away. Even you're supposed to maintain them, but they do not enforce any of that. And so I'm trying to follow with the original guidelines that the lighthouse is open for public. I do not ask for donations. The donation is your overnight stay.
All right, well, let me close with one thing. How do we find out more about your lighthouse if we want to visit?
Very simple. Just log on to bourneflats.com.
Okay,
Or you look up like Fall River, and it'll have tons of pictures.
wonderful. Well, it's great to have a real lighthouse keeper here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I want to thank everybody for being here. If you'd like to see this program again, it will air on CTN, or if you want to tell some of your friends who were not able to be with us, it will air a number of times on CTN, the Connecticut Network. You'll also be able to see it on demand on our website in just the next few days, and that's www.ct-n.com. So thank you, Lighthouse lovers, for joining us, and thank you to our wonderful panelists.